Chris Fafoy.
Mr Speaker, it's my pleasure to take a call on this Telecommunications Development Levy Amendment Bill. Mr Speaker, $150 million is a lot of money. It's a lot of money for this House to expend. So if we are going to do that, we want to make sure that it's going to be an effective use of money. And when it comes to RBI2, the $150 million, which is this basically is going to create, we want to make sure that RBI1 has been effective. Now, for those at home who don't know what RBI1 is, that's roughly about $300 million, $250 million which has come from the TDL, the Telecommunications Development Levy, which has helped some of our remote areas in our rural sector become more connected. There are many, many reasons why that is good for our country, and they have been said on both sides of the House. Obviously, the primary sector, the health and well-being of our remote areas, and of course, economic development. Mr Speaker, why we do have a problem with this piece of legislation is that we haven't had enough of an assessment of RBI1, the first $300 million of this program, to see whether or not it has been effective. And at the Commerce Select Committee, a Select Committee that would have loved to have seen this bill, by the way, I'll come back to that later, we heard from a number of submitters just on I think it was yesterday morning. Oh, it seems so long ago. Yesterday morning, about the lack of assessment that has been done about the spending and the effectiveness of RBI1. So, Mr Speaker, we do have an issue with this piece of legislation, of course it being a new tax, but also because we haven't seen enough evidence of the effectiveness of RBI1. Mr Speaker, and I do want to point to a submission given to us yesterday by Internet New Zealand, if I may, at the Commerce Select Committee, where it pointed out its concern around the lack of assessment of RBI1. Mr Speaker, because, and this came about by 3 areas in Dunedin or in Otago who've petitioned the Commerce Select Committee about the lack of effectiveness in their experience of the Rural Broadband Initiative. Basically, they don't think that this initiative has served their community well and hasn't made them as connected as was promised by the government. Mr Speaker, Internet New Zealand said in its submission, these petitioners are motivated not by a lack of clarity, but by a lack of satisfaction. Then we said different requirement. This could call for a verification of commitments made as part of the RBI delivery to ensure that whichever provider responsible is delivering the expectations that were set. Have the committed timeframes for RBI rollouts been met? Is the minimum speed commitment of 5 megabits per second also being met? So, Mr Speaker, there is concern out there in those rural communities who are promised a service of 5 megabits per second, but that has not been their experience. And for us to sit here and say, well, if that's the experience of $300 million of investment, and we're about to say, here's another $150 million for the second phase of the RBI, then we on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, think we need a better assessment of whether that $300 million that has been spent on RBI1 has been spent effectively. There is some good things in this bill, I believe, especially around the black spots. I think that is a good development in terms of State Highway 1. If someone can look at the Naranga Gorge, it'll be quite useful. But also for tourism as well. If we can get the government to look at those black spot areas, that will be useful. But, Mr Speaker, this piece of legislation doesn't meet a test for us to support it because, Mr Speaker, as I said, $150 million is the commitment here. $15 million for each year that we are continuing this levy, a levy that wasn't necessarily promised. And, Mr Speaker, we want to know if we're going to be spending $150 million more, whether the first $300 million was spent effectively. Communities in small, remote, rural areas around this country, Mr Speaker, don't think that is the case. Internet New Zealand, a bit of a watchdog for these kinds of issues, doesn't believe that's the case. And because of that, we share those concerns and we're not going to support this piece of legislation.
Kanwaljit Singh Bakshi.
Thank you.